We are going to discuss one final way to solve quadratic equations, and that is by using the quadratic formula. So our objective today is to solve quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. Okay, so with the quadratic formula, we have to have a quadratic equation in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is the coefficient or number in front of x squared, b is the number in front of x, and c is the constant. So you can use the quadratic formula when no other methods work. So if a quadratic equation, it can't be solved by factoring or the square root property, this is when you would use the quadratic formula. Okay, and the quadratic formula is written here for you on the screen. X is equal to negative b. This means plus or minus. So that's how we would get our two solutions. The square root of b squared minus 4ac, and that is all over 2a. If you've never heard the song for the quadratic formula, I believe it's to the melody of Pop Goes the Weasel. You can find that on YouTube if you like to remember things in song. If I play it for you, you can't unhear it, so I'm not going to do that. But there are some tools to remember the quadratic formula, and it's also included on the formula sheet. Okay, so with that, we'll jump right into our examples. Example 1, solve for x and simplify your answer. So we are in the section talking about the quadratic formula. In the next lesson, for the next homework, we'll talk about putting it all together. Okay, so these we'll solve using the quadratic formula. So we have to make sure it's in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So with that, our first step is to subtract 16x from both sides. Now, when you do this, you want to make sure that the powers are in descending order so it looks like our form. Okay, so we have 4x squared here. I don't know why I wrote 6, probably because I saw the 16. Minus 16x plus 13 is equal to 0. Okay, so in this case, a is equal to 4. B is equal to, the 16 is negative, there's a minus in front of it, negative 16, and c is equal to 13. Okay, so since the formula is pretty long, I'm going to go to the next slide so that we can plug everything in. Okay, and again, a is 4, b is negative 16, c is 13. Okay, and the quadratic formula is negative b, or opposite of b. Okay, some like to think of it that way. Okay, so if we start by plugging everything in, we have x equals, there's a negative sign in the formula, and b is negative. So that's minus a negative 16, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b is negative 16. So we're squaring negative 16. I highly recommend putting that in parentheses. Minus 4 times a, which is also 4, times c, which is 13. And this whole thing is divided by 2 times a. Okay, so 2 times 4. So now we continue on and simplify. So minus negative 16, that becomes a positive 16. We have plus or minus. Okay, 16 squared, you can use your calculator. Negative 16 squared is 256. Minus, and then this is 4 times 13, 208, all divided by 8. Okay. Keep going, we have subtraction in the square root. So this is 16 plus or minus 256 minus 208 is 48 divided by 8. Okay, and we'll pause here for a moment. So you might be tempted right here to simplify with the 16, 48, and 8. Well, we need to simplify the square root first. Okay, the 48 is not just a number on its own, it's under the radical or it's under the square root. So we can't divide it by 8. Okay, what we have to do is we have to simplify the root first and then see what simplifies. Okay, so if we take the number 48, this breaks down into 16 and 3, and 16 breaks down into 4 and 4. So the square root of 48 simplifies into 4 square root of 3. Okay, so instead of the square root of 48, that's what I'm going to write. So we have x is equal to 16 plus or minus 4 square root of 3 over 8. Okay, now there's a couple different ways to simplify from here. The first way is, notice now, 16, 4, and 8. If you're going to simplify, it has to be a number that divides into all 3 in those places, not what's under the square root. That's protected by the square root in a way. Okay, so all of these are divisible by 4, so this would be 4 plus or minus, this technically becomes a 1, over 2. So your two answers here would be x not x, 4. 4 plus the square root of 3 over 2, 4 minus the square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. The second way, and I'm going to do this over here, the second way is to break up the numerator since we have the same denominator. So this would be x would be equal to 16 over 8 plus or minus 4 square root 3 over 8. Okay, and when you add fractions with same denominators, you add the numerators and keep the denominator so we get back to the original. So then this simplifies x is equal to 2 plus or minus 4. This becomes a 1, this becomes a 2, square root 3 over 2. So my two answers then would be 2 plus square root of 3 over 2, 2 minus square root of 3 over 2. And now once you do it this way, just the square root of 3 is being divided by 2 because we simplified 16 divided by 8. Okay, so either answer will work. Both of these are considered to be simplified. Okay, let's keep going. Example number 2, solve for x and simplify your answer. So we have a is equal to 1, b is equal to -1, and c is equal to 3. So we plug these into our formula. X is equal to opposite of b. So since b is -1, you can think of that as +1, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And then you keep simplifying. Okay, so we have 1 plus or minus -1 squared is 1. This is minus 4 times 1 times 3 is 12 over 2. Okay, keep going. I'll probably rewrite this. Okay, 1 minus 12 is -11 divided by 2. Okay, and now we need to simplify the square root. Okay, so square root of -11 would be the square root of -1 times the square root of 11, and the square root of -1 is I. Okay, so this is I square root of 11. So now we have x is equal to 1 plus or minus I square root of 11 over 2. Okay, so your two answers would be x is equal to 1 plus I square root of 11 over 2, 1 minus I square root of 11 over 2, or this is the same as 1/2 plus I square root of 11 over 2. Okay, so any of those will work. Okay, solve for x and simplify your answer. So again, we have to make sure that this is set equal to 0 so that we can identify our a, b, and c. So we start off by subtracting 1 from both sides. So we have 2x squared minus 13x minus 1 is equal to 0. Okay, so a is equal to 2, b is equal to -13, and c is equal to -1. Okay, so if we start plugging this into the quadratic formula, we have x is equal to minus -13 plus or minus the square root of -13 squared minus 4 times a times c. Did I get it on there? Maybe not. Let me rewrite this so it all fits. Minus -13 plus or minus the square root of -13 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so if we keep simplifying, we have x is equal to 13 plus or minus -13 squared is 169. Okay, now you have to be careful at this point. There's a couple different ways to think of this. There's two negative signs going on. So you can think of it as minus 4 times 2 times -1. So that would be minus, okay, from this minus sign here. 4 times 2 is 8 times -1 is -8, and that becomes positive. Okay, or you can think of it as -4 times 2 times -1, which is positive 8. So either way, we are adding 8 to 169 and then dividing by 2 times a. Okay, and so we'll go to the next slide. That looks like an 18. It's not, that's a plus sign. Okay, so x is equal to 13 plus or minus the square root of 169 plus 8 is 177 divided by 4. So at this point, you would want to see if you could simplify the square root of 177. We can't because 177 is a prime number. So if it doesn't simplify, this is your final answer. So you would have x is equal to 13 plus Square root of 177 divided by 4, 13 minus square root of 177 divided by 4. Okay, the software may have the plus or minus symbol that you could use, but I will tell you that you do need to know how to write this as two separate answers. Okay, example number 4, solve for x and simplify your answer. So again, we'll make sure that this is set equal to 0 by starting off subtracting 7x from both sides. To get 3x squared minus 7x plus 6 is equal to 0. We have a is equal to 3, b is equal to negative 7, c is equal to 6. Okay, so using the quadratic formula then, we have x is equal to opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 divided by a. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. Make sure you have this written down. I'm going to simplify what's inside of the square root and the denominator. So x is equal to, this is 7 plus or minus negative 7 squared is 49, minus, and then 4 times 3 times 6 is 72, divided by 2 times 3, which is 6. Okay, so we keep going. 7 plus or minus the square root, 49 minus 72 is negative 23 divided by 6. Okay, now you might be saying 23 is a prime number, but there's a negative in there. So that indicates that we're going to need to be dealing with I, or that I is going to be part of our answer here. Okay, so the square root of negative 23 is equal to negative 1 times square root of 23, which is I square root 23. Okay, so x is equal to 7 plus or minus I square root of 23 over 6. So as two answers, this is 7 plus I square root 23 over 6, 7 minus I square root 23, all divided by 6. All right, so for the next example, we're asked to solve our x and round our answers to 3 decimal places. It may say to solve this graphically, but you won't be able to use a graphing tool on an assessment. So I am going to show you what the graph looks like because it helps explain what we're solving for here. But then we're going to talk about how to use the quadratic formula and your calculator to get the answers rounded to 3 decimal places. So I went to a website called desmos.com, and what you can do is it'll allow you to graph. So we are graphing 3x squared plus 32x plus 14 is equal to 0. Okay, so you can see this is going to make a parabola or the U-shaped graph. So this is a right side up U, or you could have the upside down U. And when it's set equal to 0, that means y is equal to 0. So really, when we're solving these quadratic equations, we're looking at where the graph is crossing the x-axis. That's where y is equal to 0. And for practical applications, that can tell us a lot. Okay, but I'm going to zoom in using the pinch zoom feature. And if I click here, one of my solutions should be negative 0.457. And if I click over here, another one of mine should be negative 10.21. This doesn't go to 3 decimal places. But I'll show you how to get this using the calculator as well. Okay, so we are going to go back. So we have our quadratic equation. We have a is equal to 3, b is equal to 32, and c is equal to 14. Okay, so now we have x is equal to negative b. Okay, so this time this is going to stay negative because b is not negative in this case. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Okay, so make sure you have this written down, and we are going to go to the next slide. So x is equal to negative 32 plus or minus 32 squared is 1,024. 4 times 3 times 14 is 108. Let me just check that. Oh, 168, I'm sorry. Divided by 2 times a, which is 6. Okay, so all I'm going to do here is the subtraction under the root. Since we're being asked to take our answer to 3 decimal places, I'm not going to fully simplify the square root. Okay, so this is x is equal to negative 32 plus or minus square root of 856 divided by 6. Okay, and so I'm going to go to the next slide and show you what our two answers end up being. So we have x is equal to negative 32 plus square root of 856 divided by 6, and we have x is equal to negative 32 minus square root of 856 divided by 6. When you put this in your calculator, you have to be very, very careful. So there's a couple of options. If your calculator has a fraction button, you can click the fraction button, put in the numerator, put in the denominator, and hit equals. If you're using a sort of Texas Instruments like I have, there's a couple of options. The first is to do the numerator first, so negative 32 plus square root of 856. Okay, and you get a long decimal. So do the numerator, then hit enter. Numerator, enter, because the entire numerator is divided by 6. And then divide by 6 to get negative 0.45708 ... and we're supposed to go to 3 decimal places. So this will stay as negative 0.457, exactly what we got when we graphed it. Okay. The next way to do this is you can put the entire numerator in your calculator in parentheses. So open parentheses, negative 32 minus the square root of 856. Okay, now what those parentheses are doing is telling your calculator that that's the entire numerator. Then divide by 6 to get negative 10.20957. Again, we're rounding to 3 decimal places. Okay, so that 9 is going to go up. It's going to go up to 10. So this is negative 10.210. If the system is asking for 3 decimal places, you do need to put that 0 in there. Okay. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, let me know. Also, if you are having trouble getting these in your calculator, let me know that as well.